Hi. What I'm going to explain is usually called panpsychism, although I don't really like that word. It's too weak for the mechanisms described here. It is useful only because it tells us that mentality is not an accident in a dead universe. But this model on the screen says more than that. It says mentality is an operative in that it exerts pressure. It participates in the selection of history. Thought is not just present in the world. Thoughts help create the world. We live within Wigner's friend, within Wigner's friend, within Wigner's friend. Collapse within collapse within collapse. And if we decide Everett's many worlds into the one world that we know and love, that micro decisions over every Planck length moment across all of space-time adds a weight of thought. And those thoughts add up and enter our heads as thoughts. And memories also work with the same CPT ledger symmetry. That is the starting point. The upper equation on the screen gives the basic rule. Standard quantum mechanics applies the admissible histories and their amplitude squared weighting. That part remains Max Born's rule remains. Max Born is Olivia Newton-John's grandfather, but he gave us the Born rule, which is the part of that. And what I've added is, I'm Hilborn, and this is my mathematics. I've added expectation weight from across space-time, because there are no now moments. So a candidate history is not selected merely because it is quantum admissible, but because it is quantum admissible and coherent with distributed expectation from every loci of comparison. That already moves us beyond random history collapse. Quantum mechanics needs to be looked at as a random history generator or history selection. And only this history selection model works without paradox. 36% of physicists believe that history is created randomly when we collapse history with observation in the Copenhagen interpretation. Everyone thinks about the end result, whether the cat is alive or dead, as the superposition example goes, but we don't consider the history of the cats. Because every time we close our eyes and open our eyes, we're putting the entire universe in a superposition where we collapse the entire history every time we open our eyes. And so does the cat. So the point is, expectation is not inert here. Expectation is not just a label attached after the fact. Expectation is a form of thought pressure because it weighs every collapse. And because there is no privileged universal now, that thought pressure is not trapped inside a single present brain state. It is distributed across the block universe and can operate through many loci of comparison at once, also giving us that global consistency. That is why collapse must be understood as history selection, and physics must be understood to understand this video. If one world is lived, then what is selected cannot be merely an isolated event. A full history is selected, a past that coheres, an observer chain that coheres. The past must form events that lead to this future. And we're building towards something that we haven't yet become. It's the future that must remain viable in everything that we do. And there's a structure of relationships that make the chosen branch intelligible. So the object of collapse is not the local result, it is the coherent history that we create to reach this result and beyond. Once you understand that panpsychism changes form, the block universe, the future, is already there in a certain form. And we have to maintain that form in a fuzzy way. Ordinary panpsychism usually stops at the claim that mind is everywhere in degree. Fine, but that is not enough. The real question is whether mentality has mechanics. In the Born-Hilborn interpretation of mathematics, it does. Any stable locus of comparison contributes to selected history, and it can do so not only being present, but by exerting weight of thought. That weight of thought term matters. Thought is not merely a private image sealed inside a nervous system. It's not just daydreams of worry. A thought is one mode in which expectation becomes physically relevant. It is a directional pressure in the field of possible histories. This does not mean every passing fantasy instantly rewrites the universe. It means that thoughts are not epiphenomenal. They belong to the architecture by which coherent history is selected. This is where this interpretation goes beyond weak panpsychism and moves toward what could fairly be called psychic panpsychism, if one wants the term, not because every stone is a human medium, but because loci of comparison are not merely passive containers of fate experience. They can exert influence across the selected history process. That includes individual thought, group thought, organized attention, shared purpose, synchronized fear, coordinated hope, and what older language would have called psychic pressure. That is not an ornamental addition. It follows from the rule itself. If expectation weights history, if thought is one form of expectation, then thought has causal standing in the selection architecture. And causal doesn't have to be past to present. It can be future to past. So the word observer needs to be made precise in this framework. An observer is not just a person looking at an instrument. The better phrase is locus of comparison. A locus of comparison is any bounded system capable in some degree of distinguishing itself from environment, one state from another, continuation from breakdown, viable pattern from non-viable pattern. Basically, we're talking about memory. This is where Markov blankets matter. A Markov blanket gives the mathematics of boundedness. It tells us when a system has enough internal, external structure to count as a real participant in the weighting process. An individual waiter. This produces a graded model. A human mind contributes more than a thermostat. A cat contributes more than a stone. A flock of birds contributes something different from the birds taken one at a time. A social movement contributes something different from the individuals inside it. A civilization, a ritual group, a fearful crowd, a disciplined school, a market, a church, an army, a mob, a loving family. These are not merely collections. They can function as group loci of comparison with their own structured thought pressure. That is one of the important points often missed. Even the rich have their own external pressures associated with the money and their choices, and there's so much. Your model does not only imply individual mentality and degrees, it also implies collective thought forms. These thought forms approach us, petition us, lobby our minds. A flock turns as one because information is shared across distributed loci, but standard biology can describe the local mechanism. But our model asks the deeper question, why do distributed systems so often converge into one purposeful pattern? Why do groups acquire direction, mood, attractor state, symbolic, persistent, and common experience? Why do shared images, fears, myths, and names come to behave like external forces? The answer here is that group level expectation is real. Group thought is real. Shared purpose is not merely a story humans tell themselves afterwards. The brain body becomes too small for the temporal mechanics of the mind as CPT ledger comparative symmetry. It is part of the weighting process by which history has become coherent enough to be selected. This is a selecting history model. That is why the earlier summary was incomplete. It described mentality as contributing to weighting, but it did not fully state that thought itself is weight, and that this applies not only to isolated individuals but to coordinated group structures. I've also updated this video on panpsychism to include the mathematics, and I also refer to it now as history selection model, as opposed to just saying that the past changes, as I used to. I used to say that expectation causes quantum collapse even into the perceived past and the mathematics, but thinking of it as a history selection model is a better way to think of quantum mechanics. If you don't think of quantum mechanics as a history selection model which solves everything, then you're thinking of quantum mechanics wrong. So once we understand that, the combination problem also looks different. The standard question is, how many tiny minds combine into one big mind? This model gives a better answer than any others. It is not merely distributed local constraint, or it's not merely distributed loci constrain one coherent history. It is also that distributed loci can generate shared thought pressure toward that history. So there's a thought pressure The combination problem is not solved only by passive consistency in the global weighting process. It is solved also by the active coherence pressure of that weight of thought. That we're steered. The universe isn't fully, like we can refuse thoughts and we can accept thoughts. That's our only free will, is accepting thoughts or refusing thoughts. But if we refuse the thought, then it can go to someone else and it can fulfill itself, whether it be a cruel thought or a happy thought, through someone else, if it can influence someone else. So it's up to you what you do. But the universe is fuzzy. It's not set, fully determined. So you can bend it a little bit. So the little minds fuse into one mind with this weight. And it's not merely many loci constrain one selected history. It's many loci exert thought, weight, and expectation pressure, and this convergent pressure selects one coherent history in which a macro subject, a cat or us, or a macro purpose becomes stable. I often say that a cat expecting a bowl of milk helps create the universe, because it collapses a reality in which a cat births the universe, because it creates the need for the cow, it creates the need for the meadow, it creates the need for the grass, creates the need for the potter and the bowl and the farmers and our ancestors, and a universe big enough to contain it all. The cat's expectation presses towards a world where all this is necessary. Milk, bowls, cows, field, farmers, continuity, and habit all belong together. Likewise, a family's shared expectation presses toward histories of continuity. A culture's fears press toward histories that realize those fears. A disciplined scientific community can press toward one structure of inquiry. A frightened crowd can press towards one structure of panic. A loving collective can press towards one structure of care. In that sense, your mental abilities include panpsychism in a stronger sense as actual psychism, because we have group purposes like a flock of birds or a school of fish, but in a more complicated level. But the mathematics of interacting thought fields are all on the screen in front of you. That is why the lower half of the screen matters so much. The lower equation is not merely about private inner life. It is about how a selected history becomes specified for bounded loci of comparison through continuity, function, boundary, and teleological relevance. And once one allows thought itself to enter the structure, the lower equation can be read not only as the mechanics of individual mentality, but as the mechanics of transmitted and shared significance. This is why teleology enters so naturally. If future-compatible forms matter, then purpose is not a poetic gloss laid over blind mechanism. Purpose is part of the weighting structure. A group can have purpose. A lineage can have purpose. A civilization can have purpose. A species can have purpose. And I don't like using the term qualia, but qualia is purpose. And these are not merely verbal unities. They can become real weighted centers if their structure is stable enough, coordinated enough, and persistent enough. So panpsychism is too weak a label. The model is not merely saying that there's something is like it. It's like something. It is saying that mentality in degrees exerts selective pressure on reality through selective history, through this mathematics above. And that explains, and it also explains why thought creates a pressure that's put upon us and creates the thoughts that actually enter our brains, and if we do the math. So there are shared thought forms that are physically relevant, and that selected history reflects the distributed pressure of both individual and collective loci of comparison. This is an idealism comparison. So there are thoughts could be perceived as having bodies, for example. This also explains why memory cannot remain local. If thought and expectation are externally structured, the memory cannot be reduced to little inscription in tissue. The temporal mechanics of CP tree ledger symmetry, we need that for comparison. The brain becomes an interface because the brain body is too small. It becomes an interface, index, coordinator. The deeper ledger is selected history itself, along with the wider field of stabilized relations through which thought, recognition, and continuity recur. Memory is the selected history itself. Wherever stable comparison exists, mentality contributes to the weighting of selected history. Wherever stable comparison exists, thought pressure can arise. Wherever thought pressure arises, it can contribute to the weighting of selected history. And wherever many such pressures converge, individual and collective mental forms can shape the coherence of the world that becomes lived. So if someone insists on the word panpsychism, I would use it politely and then immediately correct it. This is not merely a universe where mind is everywhere in faint degree. It is a universe where thought is mechanistically relevant, where loci of comparison do not merely experience but exert, where histories are selected by convergent expectation, and where both individual and collective mentality belong to the causal grammar of reality. And cause can precede effect. Effect can precede cause. That is the mechanism. That is how panpsychism must be understood in the Born-Hilborn interpretation rule principle above in the mathematics you see before you. So, this is how panpsychism works. The end.